The Golden Age of Piracy, Blackbeard's Adventure. Chapter 1. Whispers of the Sea. In the year of our Lord, 1715, as the Caribbean Sea shimmered beneath rolling clouds like coins spilled from the satchel of some bored god, the world trembled under the sway of wind and timber, salt and steel. The age of empires was cracking, and from its splinters rose the sound of flapping sails and creaking hulls, of cannon fire echoing like thunder across distant isles, and of voices bold enough to deny crowns their power. And in the belly of that growing storm, seated upon the edge of fate, was a man not yet legend, a man not yet wearing the name Blackbeard. He was Edward. No title, no myth, just Edward, son of an English merchant and a mother whom no records mention, thereby belonging more to the sea than to any land. He walked the wharves of New Providence beneath sky-tattered clouds, the musk of old tobacco mingling with the scent of molasses and blood-soaked planks. His boots were salt-bitten, his eyes storm-gray, and he bore a hunger, not for food but for the shape of power, the way it moved, sounded, breathed, the way it could conquer men not just through blades, but through belief. At night in that lawless port, the so-called pirate republic, Edward listened. He listened in dark taverns, where former privateers told tales laced with smoke and rum about ghost ships and kings of the deep. He listened to Spanish prisoners, bound and bruised, whispering of an armada that vanished off the coast of Hispaniola, bearing treasures so vast gold wept from their hulls. He listened to the mad pastor rambling to the sea itself on the shore, calling her his wife and warning that the marked ones would rise again. Edward did not yet understand these whispers, but he remembered them. More than once he visited the gallows behind the fort, where rotted bodies swung like cursed wind chimes in the passing breeze. Once proud sailors turned examples for the next. He stared up, studying their boots and the shape of their necks. What manner of man did it take to walk up those stairs and not tremble? He found his partial answer aboard a sloop named the Ranger under Captain Hornigold, a man who smelled always of cigars and salt rot, and who sailed with the belligerent calm of a priest marrying heaven and hell. Hornigold taught him with lash and look alike. The sea doesn't forgive, boy, but she sometimes forgets, if you carve deep enough. Under that stern tutelage during Queen Anne's War, Edward proved himself again and again. Boarding parties at midnight, escaping storm-lashed battles with only one sail and a prayer, negotiating with mutinous tongues under a moon that showed its fangs. By the end, Hornigold no longer called him boy but Thatch, but peace came like rot to a ripe fruit. When Queen Anne's War concluded, privates became pirates or paupers. Hornigold, clinging to loyalty like a barnacle to bone, began refusing attacks on English merchants. Edward, still young, proud, and increasingly certain he was casting his own shadow, chafed. It was off the coast of St. Vincent that opportunity came, not like thunder's roar, but a whisper borne by spyglass. A sleek French slave ship, the Concorde, laden with spices and coin, limping along with the arrogance of being unbothered. Edward struck fast, under cover of early mist, sails raised like wings against the sun. With men borrowed and blades borrowed with less ceremony, he stormed the Concorde amid cries of alarm in harsh French. The battle was brief. Blood was less than breath. When the captain of the Concorde surrendered, Edward offered his hand, not in mercy, but in command. And it was there, standing upon planks still wet with the ocean's salt and blood both, that Edward Thatch rechristened the ship. Not some exotic name, not a trinket from myth. He called her Queen Anne's Revenge, and in doing so named himself anew. Whether it came to him in a dream or as he stared into a barrel's reflection, none could say. But from that day forward, the man who carved his path across the Caribbean no longer answered to Edward. He was Blackbeard. In those early nights aboard the Revenge, when the moon rose wide and red as a garnet stolen from royal crown, Blackbeard began braiding slow-burning fuses into his beard and hair, not as superstition, but as spectacle. Fire and smoke flickering around his angry eyes would freeze even seasoned captains. It was not enough to win. One had to become the nightmare of surrender. Yet even then, something stirred beneath his growing fame. Visions, whispers. At first he told no one, not even himself. In his dreams came a woman dressed in red, her hair black as soot, her eyes an absence. She danced upon the shore of empty islands, always facing away, always humming that same tune, 3 low notes followed by silence. Sometimes she whispered his name in a voice like tide foam. Other times she screamed. She began appearing during the day, too, her reflection in glass bottles, the shape of her cloak in the hang of the sails. "You are fated," she would say. He did not know what that meant. So he asked Anansi. The man called Anansi had been found bound inside a captured Portuguese galley en route from the Gold Coast, chained after preaching rebellion and riddles to the crew until they threw themselves overboard one by one. He was old, with long fingers and teeth sharpened to blunted points, a weaver of stories and handler of omens. "You are not just a man on a ship," Anansi told him the first night Blackbeard spoke of the dreams. "You sail on a current older than time's teeth. Tides obey what you become." Absurd, Blackbeard thought, until the stars moved for him. The second omen arrived in the form of a map, or rather, a story of one. In Kingston, while trading rum for powder, a dying sailor sought him out, pulling aside his shirt to reveal ink faded into skin, half a tattoo shaped like waves coiling around a spiral. "There are 3 of us," he said, his coughing thick with salt blood. 3 maps, 3 backs. Lost by time's hand, reborn by fire. He died before Blackbeard could ask him more, but the merchant who'd healed the man had more to share. Stories told in Spanish ports of lost gold carried by a galleon that never reached Madrid, a cargo not of coins but of control, something blessed and cursed in the same breath. The treasure, he said, was sacred, hidden. Only those with all 3 tattoos could find it. At first, Blackbeard dismissed it as another fool's tale, but that night the woman appeared again in his dream, this time placing her burning hand upon his chest. And where her fingers touched, the skin turned to gold and smoke rippled outward until nothing remained but a throne of bones on a barren island soaked in sunless light. From that moment he was no longer seeking ships or plunder. He sought destiny. But not all fire burns clean. There were times, in still black waters between raids, when even he feared the silence below decks, times when the creaking boards spoke languages forgotten, and the rats crawled sideways in patterns shaped like eyes. Valencia, his mute cartographer rescued from a doomed Spanish prison ship, stared too long into compass glass and wept silently when the moon turned crimson. It was the sea's way of demanding remembrance, of insisting myth be paid in blood. The men aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge began calling her the Ship of Smoke. They began calling their captain King of Curses. Fleet captains whispered he dined with ghosts, that he bled black when cut, that he could strike down men with a glance if bathed in starlight. These were lies, of course, but lies have gravity, and the more they were spoken, the more they became true. That night, with sails slack and the ocean smooth beneath like glass turning to stone, Blackbeard sat alone at the stern. Not a breath stirred the air. He held before him a small silver mirror once belonging to a French baroness. His reflection flickered. Behind him in the glass stood the woman in red. "You have crossed the threshold," she whispered, her voice like rust over velvet. "Beyond this map lies not gold, but storm." He smiled as he dipped the fuses into pitch and tucked them into braids with fingers calloused and precise. Storm or not, he would sail on. Terror, after all, was only a form of beauty unfinished. And in that moment, lit only by the slow rising of a blood-colored moon over endless waters, the man named Blackbeard was born not of knife or cannon, but lift, shape, and inconscious, under the Ganya, viz. All his Lord should lead or torture. The morning fog hung over the emerald horizon like a shroud, heavy and briny, whispering secrets across the decks of the newly claimed Queen Anne's Revenge. The ship, sleek and gilded, bristling with cannon, sails like thunderclouds, moved through the sea not as a vessel but as a force of nature. Her black hull, burnished from stolen French design and now boasting English ruthlessness, cut across the Caribbean like a blade too fine to belong in mortal hands. Edward Thatch stood at the helm, his hand resting lightly on the weather-worn wheel, a twisted smile hidden beneath the thundercloud of his untamed beard. Braided through it were smoldering slow match fuses, not yet lit, but ominous in their stillness. The deck beneath his boots still bore traces of the blood spilled during her capture, and yet the crew moved with the reverence of pilgrims. They knew this ship did not belong to them. It belonged to the legend their captain was becoming. The Queen Anne's Revenge had a life of its own. She groaned and creaked, not with age, but with presence. 100 guns were mounted along her flanks, each meticulously cleaned and gleaming in the morning light. Prisoners from the Concorde still lingered in the brig, their terrified murmurs adding music to the creaking wood and flapping sails. Edward had rechristened her under blood and fire, calling upon the ghost of a queen who'd died with her crown not only removed but forgotten. She was betrayed, he'd said to Israel Hands, his appointed quartermaster, and so was I. But I'll not go quietly as she did. His eyes had burned with something far older than rebellion, and in that moment Israel Hands, dangerous even among pirates, understood he no longer served a man, but a myth gaining shape. Hands was no ordinary seaman. Scarred and sun-scorched, grim and lean as a ship's mast, he enforced Edward's hesitant rule at first with steel in one hand and promise in the other. He had followed Hornigold once, too, before ambition soured the air between master and student. Now, under Blackbeard's growing shadow, even Hands began questioning what loyalty meant when your captain claimed to see the future in storms. These waters saw transformation. The Queen Anne's Revenge became a haven for the damned and the dispossessed. Calico Jack Rackham came aboard with silks in his bag and silver on his tongue, playing both fool and fox. He knew which knives were drawn and which smiles concealed poison. His ambition burnt almost as hot as Edward's, though it lingered more in the eyes of women and glory than maps scrawled in blood. And then came Anansi, a whisper more than a man, skin dark as midnight, his voice low like the hush of tide through mangrove roots. His own blur ainge has followed its Erimu, and its body affinity, and the power, all of whose nothing, nay, that means to no one. It's not more nor anything a barm, you'd make it a jock. Escaped from a Portuguese slave ship decades before, Anansi carried with him riddles older than maps. Some believed he was touched by gods forgotten by men. Others said he merely watched the world as a spider does, careful, patient, and too clever by half. No one knew how long he'd been at sea. He never spoke of his age, but he told tales late at night that made seasoned pirates murmur prayers under their breath. One such tale spoke of voodoo winds held captive in jars made of bone. Another of a sea cave where the moon was said to rise blood-red once every century, and still another, lowered in volume but never doubted, of an ancient Spanish artifact lost to history, sealed within a brass box too heavy for mortal hands, too dangerous for righteous eyes. It was during a raid just off the coast of Cuba when lore twisted into truth. The Queen Anne's Revenge intercepted a trio of merchant ships, sleek French vessels traveling a tight formation, banners stiff in a favorable wind. They never stood a chance. With cannon smoke swirling and sea shanties sung over slaughter, Edward claimed the flagship after a volley that left her rudder shredded and her captain speechless from a shattered jaw. As Hands boarded her, his boots clicking on blood-slicked planks, he found not jewels or silk, but something far more curious. A box, no longer than a man's forearm, forged in greened brass and etched with runes stranger than Arabic or Greek. Anansi approached it with reverence and fear. This, he said, as his fingertips danced over the patterns, was never meant to be found. He would say no more, but that very night, under a starless sky and the ship rocking on moonlit swells, the box began to hum. It wasn't loud, the sound more sensation than noise, but every man felt it. It settled into bones, into dreams, into the quiet spaces between memories. And the Queen Anne's Revenge changed. She grew quieter, faster. Winds favored her sails even when flags on nearby ships hung limp. Her wood no longer creaked beneath the weight of her guns. Her shadow stretched long even under midday sun. The crew began to call her the Devil's Bride. Even enemy vessels started surrendering without a single volley fired. The legend of Blackbeard spread like cholera, wild, feverish. He's immortal. He drinks fire instead of rum. They say the devil kisses his forehead nightly to bless his voyage. He whispers to ghosts, and they whisper back. None of this was denied by Edward. In fact, he welcomed the rumors. He fed them. His beard now regularly smoked during attacks, flames licking at his face like a halo of damnation. He drank gunpowder mixed with rum before battle, and his laughter during the charge rang louder than the horns of command. But on board, unease settled like mildew on old rope. Some crewmen began reporting sleepwalk. Others, their eyes bloodshot and fingers twitching, spoke of shared dreams, of a woman in crimson robes singing songs in a language that tasted like salt and ash. Rats abandoned the lower decks, mirrors cracked, and when lightning struck the mainmast one stormy dusk, the brass box below deck pulsed once, then released a low, keening sound that sent 2 men into seizures and drove a third flailing overboard. Edward, however, was unmoved. Or rather, he leaned into the madness. "A storm's only a curse if you ain't sailing with it," he growled. and he began journaling nonsense in the margins of stolen maps, glyphs drawn in circles, lines linking stars not yet born. Anansi warned him, whatever's inside that thing doesn't want gold, it wants a door opened, and we're the ones carrying the key. But Edward only smiled, tapping his long fingers on the helm, steering them deeper into unknown tides. Then let's find the lock, he said. One night, as they anchored off Tortuga's coast, a pair of Spanish galleons burning behind them, Valencia appeared. None had seen her board. Dressed in poacher's leathers, eyes haunted, lips sewn shut by thread black as ink, she stepped across the deck like someone who remembered a world long drowned. She carried nothing but a folded piece of sailcloth. She found Edward without asking, unfurled the cloth. Symbols, a piece of the map scrawled in the same glyphs as the box. She placed one finger on it, looked at Anansi. She knows where the next mark is, he whispered, reading only her stance. She bears what's left of a soul, clipped quiet by song. Blackbeard gazed into her eyes, then turned to the artifact. It had begun to hum again. Tell her, he said softly, that she's welcome aboard. But Captain, Hans interjected sharply, we don't know what she is. Edward gave him a slow, dangerous smile. In his eyes sparked something not of this world. Neither do they know what I am. From that point, the Queen Anne's Revenge no longer sailed merely across seas. She floated on fable and fate. Her wake boiled like mist over a witch's cauldron. Voices echoed below decks at night, not cries, but chanting or perhaps pleading. A brittle truce grew among the crew. Some believed in the treasure, others in the legend, others still just believed Edward was headed for something none dared name. At the bow, Valencia watched the horizon, her stitched lips twitching with words unspoken. Behind her, the brass box glowed faintly in the dark, and Edward Blackbeard Thatch walked the decks of his ship no longer as a man, but as a beacon for all that the Empire feared. The Queen Anne's Revenge sailed onward, not toward gold, but... Chapter 3. The Brotherhood's Gamble. The tropical air over Nassau hung heavy with salt and secrets, as though the wind itself waited with bated breath. Atop the hill overlooking the crooked town of drunken liberty, the pirate republic shimmered like a mirage of rebellion. Lanterns flickered in the blue to amber dusk, illuminating hulls dragged onto sand, and banners that bore no king's crest but skull and flame. Whispers curled around tavern lips, passed from palm to ear with trembling joy or shuddering dread. Blackbeard had returned. By the time night swallowed the reef-speckled sea and stars needled the dark above, Edward Thatch stood at the bow of a coal-dark sloop anchored just beyond the harbor. He was a shape cut from shadow and siege, adorned in charred leathers, twin pistols holstered like fangs, a tricorn crowning dark curls of hair laced with slow-burning fuse. Smoke curled lazily from his beard, as if his breath came from hell's own furnace. He rarely spoke aloud these nights, but when he did, even the stars seemed to shrink back from the gravity of it. Aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, none dared question his silences. In the captain's quarters, maps curled like shedding parchment. Scrawled notes inked in blood-red outlined shipping lanes, raided convoys and enclaves of lesser, upstart pirates who dared take but not share. The flickering candlelight danced across Anansi's face as he muttered over a piece of riveted vellum with glyphs carved in obsidian. Near him, Valencia spread her fingers across a bone panel, pressing softly where symbols pulsed just beyond the layer of reality. Israel, hands leaned, arms crossed against a barnacled beam, watching both haunted and hollow-eyed. Calico Jack paced like a man bitten too many times by a dream that wouldn't die. "Someone summoned the court," said Israel finally, the first to break the brittle stillness. "Someone wants us gathered like hens in a storm." "And eggs crack easy," Calico Jack muttered, scuffing a boot heel against the groaning floorboard. "Aye," Blackbeard rumbled, voice low as reef thunder. "But which cockerel wants to set the hen-house alight?" The summons had been delivered 3 nights prior, a piece of mast plank branded with the seal of the Brethren Court, a stylized Ouroboros burning with flame, slipped into his maps with no trace of entrance, a sign, a warning, a dare. The court had not convened in over 8 years, not since the final embers of Queen Anne's War had guttered and the pirate lords scattered into legends and lonely shorelines. For them to gather now, it could only mean war, or death, or both. And yet Blackbeard answered the call. They sailed under new moon, cloaked in silence deeper than fog. Only the Queen Anne's Revenge bore into the open sea. The rest of the fleet, left behind in disguise or anchored in safe coves, waited under orders. Blackbeard suspected betrayal. It always circled meetings of power like sharks beneath blooded decks. They reached Tormenta Cove by starlight, an inlet carved into a volcanic island with a crescent beach like the grin of a dead man. Fire pits blazed between twisted pines. Anchored nearby were ships known and loathed. The Rover, the Devil's Fang, the Crimson Maiden, smugglers, warlords, thieves who once called each other brother only in jest or jesting murder. Upon the jagged shore a great circle had been drawn in ashen salt, ringed with totems of bonewood and black pearls. At the center, a single throne of driftwood sat empty, waiting for rebellion incarnate. The pirate lords arrived like gods over uneven tides. Anne Bonny wore a crimson sash soaked in the blood of 3 governors, sharp-eyed, blade-sworn, her laugh cut like broken glass. Stead Bonnet, ill at ease, wrung his manicured hands above a coat too fine for the stench of salt. He wore regret like armor, but desperation beneath. Charles Vane strode forward last, silent and brooding, smoke curling from his lips. A madman, or genius, sometimes both. But all grew still when Blackbeard entered. The smoke of his beard coiled with intent. His boots bled salt across the ash circle. The fire pit flickered unnaturally. "Brothers and bastards," he said, and his voice cracked thunder across the cliffs. "Let us speak plain." No one smiled. That was the power he brought an end to pretense. His proposal came wrapped in the scent of gunpowder and ideas. A pirate confederacy, not a league, not a republic, according to you. "And care that yet we're kanging. Listen, it means your might because in the loop for the chief time you're signing to the subclass I'm the mark let what that thing of films beyond look at all. They get cross up a house such hidden in mere cross thing get more yell but barcoded tall. He told my it's you to some almost like are nuts about art has been caught up a collaborate pop board it's a ball tonight pimp son the nuppers was it crazy or doing my little false I know Jane Backfall just like probably the paper pulsed alive. The hell is that? Vane whispered. Blackbeard turned slowly. A map, part of it, inked across human skin. 3 bear it, perhaps more, and drawn not to treasure chests, but power older than kings. Anansi's voice sliced the silence like a reed flute. The Teunos speak of the drowned temple, lost during fire-drowned times, where gods fed on worship and sang storms into being. This map leads to its door. Bonnet stammered, eyes wild. "You expect us to rally behind dreams and whispers. This is a pirate court, not a choir for myth." "No," said Blackbeard calmly. "It is a court of the doomed, and I offer a path." Then came the twist. Valencia stepped forward, lifting her tunic from her shoulder. A tattoo, an inked serpent chasing its tail threaded along her spine. One of the 3. It shimmered as more than ink, a brand of destiny. "You see," said Edward, dark and beautiful in his certainty, "the map is real, and it leads not to gold, but to dominion." That should have ended the debate, but power tempts and repels alike. From the shadow behind the bonfire stepped a man none had expected, Hendricks of Jamaica, thought drowned, convicted by the crown. Yet here he stood, smiling thin. "I call him liar," he shouted, hand resting on pistol. "This is no speech, but sorcery." He lifted a scrap, royal parchment sealed with wax. "This wasn't called by the brethren," he growled. "This council was summoned as trap. I've already signaled His Majesty's ships. Even now they circle this cove." Gasps turned to snarls. Blades hissed from scabbards. Some reached for boats, others for throats. Blackbeard didn't move. He watched, listening to the sea eyes glinting. "They will hang us all," Anne whispered, "and burn down the cove for daring meat." "No," Edward said, low and sure. "They might catch us, but they cannot kill the current." And then came fire. Boom! Cannonballs from the open sea struck jagged shore. Ships groaned into flame. The sea turned briefly red. Men fled. Some fought. Blackbeard stood in the center, smiling like a man who had seen this in his sleep. He moved not to rally but to command. His voice rose above smoke and confusion. "Choose now, chain or chaos." It was Anansi, laughing, who cast the dagger that felled Hendricks. The Jamaican trader died ranting Latin. Just as quickly the Queen Anne's Revenge set sail again, cutting through firelight and betrayal. Blackbeard did not look back. In his cabin, as the cove burned behind him, Valencia laid out the second tattoo, Xavier's mark, lifted weeks ago from Tiburon. The two sigils shimmered as they neared each other. The artifact pulsed. In proximity they began to sing a sound not heard in centuries, a melody from the stars. And from the dark corner of the room, where ink met time, the symbols whispered a single word across Valencia's tongue for the first time. Key. Blackbeard leaned over the chart as the storm winds gathered once more. "Then we sail," he said. Chapter 4. Treacherous Tides and Forgotten Gods. The waters grew quieter the farther the Queen Anne's Revenge drifted from the known map. Trade routes, patrol paths, and even the swirling gyres that had guided sailors for centuries slipped behind them like the fading lines of a forgotten song. The sea changed its skin. No longer the glittering turquoise of the Caribbean, it dulled to a murky lapis, thick and strange, rippling as though resisting the intrusion of man and wood and iron. Even the stars above seemed to hesitate, their patterns breaking in ways that unnerved even seasoned navigators. The crew, once bound together by coin and blood, began to fray. First came the smell, not rot, no, not anything so natural. A heady aroma of crushed orchids, iron, and cinnamon that drifted across the deck during windless nights, strong enough to wake men from nightmares. Then came the lights, brief flickers along the moon's edge, like ship lanterns above a tide with no vessels. No one admitted to seeing them, yet buckets of seawater were sometimes found placed neatly at doors, and once an entire barrel of salt pork was discovered hollowed out from within, untouched by knife or tooth. Valencia, ever silent, no longer ate. She perched in the crow's nest for hours at a time, threading strands of her own hair through bone needles she kept hidden in her sleeves. Her eyes no longer blinked in rhythm with lantern light, but with surf crashes, counting something known only to herself. It was said she could now read the stars backward and forward, that she had drowned once long ago and come back only half whole. Blackbeard began to rely on her gaze instead of charts, guiding the ship as her pale finger traced lines on the horizon none could see. Then one morning, with the sun bleeding through slate clouds like a wounded god, she shattered her silence. They were skirting the edge of a spiraling reef made of pitch-black coral teeth, glistening as though wet even in dry air, a place not noted in any sailor's tale or captain's log. Birds, dozens of them, circled overhead without a sound, wings catching no wind. The water was a glass mirror, no current, no motion, and as the crew leaned over railings, pointing at shadows beneath the ship too long to be fish, Valencia descended from her lookout and began to hum. It was a sharp, high pitch and hollow sweet, like wind through a flute carved of skull. Her mouth did not move. Her voice seemed to peel itself from the air itself. Vani yo rowdy coite o mala. The effect was immediate. Two men collapsed onto the deck, limbs twitching like puppet strings yanked by a fumbling child. Jack Rackham sprang to action, shouting for the quartermaster, pistol half drawn, but Anansi grabbed his wrist with an iron grip and simply hissed, "Letter." Above them clouds split. Not parted. Solitaire was if the sky cracked open like an egg, and through it shone a brief lance of green-gold light. The coral opened like a gate, revealing a channel none had seen, and the Revenge, unbidden by wind or hand, turned of her own accord and sailed through. They had arrived at Tiburon. What lay ahead was an isle unrecorded, unnamed, but known. Somehow they all knew. It was as if they had heard of it once in the lullabies their mothers had sung to cradle them, or in the mutterings of madmen who pissed themselves at dockside taverns. The isle was real the way nightmares are real. From sea, Tiburon rose like the arch of an ancient giant's back, draped in impossible green. Trees taller than church spires breathed mist into the sky, and across the shoreline floated a low breath, not wind, that exhaled every few minutes, warm and wet and waiting. They beached in silence, even Blackbeard. Israel Hands was first to disembark. He carried 2 flintlocks and a blade longer than a bishop's staff, yet even he looked small against the jungle bloom that overtook the beachhead in creeping vines thick with thorns shaped like fishhooks. Every vine vibrated softly around their footsteps, as if the entire island were listening. The jungle swallowed the crew. Anansi whispered that they must not speak the name of the island aloud, that to name a god was to wake it. And the gods buried here had long since traded prayers for something hungry. Even the parrots seemed orderly. They mimicked not the usual sailors' shouts, but dreams. "Don't breathe," croaked one bird in Calico Jack's voice. "Hide your eyes," whispered another, echoing the ship's late cook who had died months ago from boil rot. Valencia walked barefoot, unworried. Her blood left faint red blossoms on every fern she stepped over, but she did not flinch. In her left hand she carried a shallow wooden bowl filled with bone fragments arranged like compass points. In her right, a dagger carved from a stingray's spine. At night the jungle shifted. Laughter not their own ran in between trees, fires appeared and disappeared without heat, and in the morning their youngest deckhand, Lemuel, barely 16, was found tied in vines 100 feet above the canopy, fully clothed, his eyes sewn shut with golden thread. No one buried him. They pressed onward, deeper into the island. The jungle gave way to stone. Giant statues lay half buried in moss, all depicting the same thing, men kneeling before women with serpent hair and open mouths of sharpened teeth. Eyes slanted skyward, palms raised not in prayer, but in surrender. Beneath their footing stones were worn smooth with markings, runes unlike any sailor's tongue, but which Ananzi translated with unease. Old Taino. Where the tide forgets to end, the eternal breath begins. They reached the heart of the island under moonlight where no moonlight fell. A depression in the stone floor, a shrine perhaps, held within it a man, or what had once been a man. He was alive barely, body scarified in spiral cuts, his beard plaited with spider legs and sea glass. His name, or the name he gave, was Xavier. He did not flinch when steel was drawn, or when asked for food. He reached instead between his shoulder blades to pull aside a tangled mane of hair, and showed them the second tattoo, the compass half, with an inland mountain and a constellation only visible every 93 years. In exchange, he asked for a story, not coin, not mercy. He asked Blackbeard to tell his tale, word for word, to the day when at last he crowned himself king of the sea. All things they cost like a hollow idol, and the dreams buried in green. Only then would he surrender his body to the mapping. The pirates obliged. Blackbeard carved the tattoo, line by line, onto a crewman's back, removing only flesh enough to preserve the mark. The unlucky sailor passed from blood loss, but the sigil remained. The map was nearly whole. They left Xavier at the stone temple, now half deified by their memory, but as they turned to leave, Valencia collapsed. Her body convulsed violently, mouth filled with foam, her eyes rolled back, lips whispering a string of syllables none could define. She reached to the sky and clawed, shrieking one word in perfect English, "Below." Then silence. A brilliant crystal stance of the shorter horses, and he has no goad set upon a uanai, be mixed its sense of thought, it perhaps be recreational of evidence of her grief and throwable minute. But that was heany. Lit dinner. Even Stico on Tata, sit on a coquet man, no, it was she seven. Sunday spoke and down good more than now. And tonight is she lots of voice moderate, you know. We better gas than up to finishing tunnel in pain. Puts the matter up. Just silent to take over our compatible. Oh, just I talk to him. I'm Caroline. Thank you. I was still the soul flow of it. The waters had grown still, as though the ocean itself held its breath. And in that silence something new had awoken. The Queen Anne's Revenge raised anchor and began her slow glide from the island's cursed sanctuary. Clouds bled inward, and the sun flickered like a dying lantern. Valencia no longer walked. She floated. Her feet never touched the deck, and beneath their hull something vast stirred, too large for eyes, too old for names. A storm approached not from sky, but from the sea's own blood, and Blackbeard, standing at the prow with both pistols holstered and his fuses newly lit. Chapter 5. Fire over Charleston. The winds off the Carolina coast grumbled like old gods roused too early from slumber, and the morning mist slithered low and thick across the tides, veiling the arrival of a nightmare reborn in smoke and salt. From that haze emerged the Queen Anne's Revenge, her black sails swollen with vengeance, a floating leviathan splintering the horizon. Gun ports opened like fanged maws, her 30 cannon primed with a silent promise, gold, medicine, or ruin. Charleston stirred not in greeting, but in fear. By midday the harbor was blockaded. No merchant ship could leave, no loyal vessel could approach. Anchor chains groaned as if reluctant to be braced near her. People in the cobbled streets of the city halted mid-step. The governor's mansion fell into whispered paralysis. In drawing-rooms and counting-houses, heavy-lidded nobles gawked inland at fire-red flags raised above masts that bore no crest but an hourglass and a leering skull crowned with thorns. Blackbeard had come, but not quite as they had imagined. He had swagger, yes, the cruel swagger of someone who laughs as he steps off a precipice, knowing gravity is but another rule to be rewritten. Along the piers, sailors sworn to war, to empire, to civilization, had only heard stories. Wild ones, tangled like jungle vines. They said cannonballs deflected from his ship like pebbles off heaven's gates, that he drank gunpowder dissolving in rum, that his beard, smoldering with slow burns along braided fuses, never once ignited even in stormlight, glowing like the tail of a comet. But those stories hadn't prepared Charleston for what came next. Days passed. Commerce halted. Gold stagnated in vaults. Ships from New York were turned away. Letters flew to governors. Mothers wept. Children peered through shutters with excited terror. And floating just offshore, a ring of captured ships circled the Queen Anne's Revenge like dead moons caught in a perpetual orbit. Each day at sun's peak, Blackbeard strode the decks with a torch in hand, the flames lapping at the ropes of his beard, his voice booming over the greed and guilt of Charleston. I want quinine. I want your surgeon. I want your chests of iron and your rows of coin, or I will rend your city wide open and watch your prayers sink below the waves. But it wasn't gold that brought Blackbeard here, not truly. It was need, yes, but of an older kind. A desperation crouched behind his eyes, deeper than any chest of doubloons. Valencia was dying. Below deck, the phantom woman, born mute, now raving, screamed in dreams that wailed across hulls. Each hour she wasted brought her closer to death, or worse. Her skin festered around warm runes, the ancient script of the Taino bleeding through like old ink, resurfacing. None knew what afflicted her. Anansi whimpered when near her. His charms wilted. Even Elijah Crane, bound, bruised, but strangely trusted, could not decipher the matter. He studied her skin, her ramblings in tongues that twisted the marrow, and whispered that she was transforming. No, Blackbeard said, as if to fate itself, she's remembering. Crane wasn't sure what haunted the pirate more, the woman's illness or the answers she might die carrying. Elijah, drawn aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge not more than a fortnight before, had come unwillingly, a botanist and scholar caught in a storm of steel and shadow. He'd been taken from Charleston that very week, dragged from his garden by pirates who'd seen the third tattoo coiled around his forearm, passed unknowingly through bloodlines like a plague or a prophecy. His father, a sailor swallowed by Hispaniola, had borne the mark, and now Elijah, fated or not, was a key to a door he had no wish to open. And yet, something within him kindled, a longing like pollen on the breeze. He dreamed strange dreams now. Of a temple between waves, of lightning that sang, of blood that whispered maps. Between his fear he felt curiosity blooming like forbidden vines. So when Valencia cried his name in a voice that was not hers, but his mother's, long dead, Elijah did not hide. He listened, he stayed. And in his quiet moments in the underbelly of the ship, reading his father's journal under lantern light, Elijah realized something no one else had. That the tattoos were not a map, but a memory transferred through generations. Inked flesh echoing a past no history had dared write. Valencia's mark, Xavier's script, and his own. Together they conjured shapes under moonlight that bent star lines and sang of a chamber beneath the roots of the world. A temple, yes, but more than that. A forge, not for gold, but for kings. Blackbeard understood this, or at least some ember within him did, and he feared it. That was why Charleston stood trembling. When the emissaries came, white-flagged, stoop-shouldered, sick with fear, they brought chests of medical tinctures and roots, quinine in ceramic jars, gold coins sealed in Spanish chests, and parchment they begged him to sign in return for their survival. Blackbeard merely stared, burning ropes, writhing smoke above his shoulders, and asked them how many of Charleston's fathers had buried their sons' sins in shallow graves of debt and slavery. "Save your ink," he said. "Blood writes better." And then he brought Elijah forward. "Tell them, boy," he whispered. "Tell them what's beneath the gold, what's deeper than empire. Tell them what your father's bones lie hiding." And so the botany student, brilliant and broken, unrolled his arm, revealing the third and final tattoo which now glimmered under firelight like phosphorescence in dark water. It writhed, shifted. When held near the artifact stolen from the French 2 moons ago, the lines moved across his skin, the compass of flesh aligned. Valencia's breathing steadied, and something pulsed through the Queen Anne's Revenge that every sailor felt like thunder speaking just beneath the keel. Then came cannon fire, a distant boom. One of the blockade ships, manned by a rogue Royal Navy captain, fired a warning. Likely to impress a diplomat, or perhaps in a fit of sudden bravery, the Queen Anne's Revenge turned her broadsides, the city of Charleston iced with terror. Blackbeard addressed the envoy again, voicing the quiet that now dominated the world. This was kindness. Within the hour, the city surrendered all reserves of medicine, and more than a dozen nobles offered hush gold to be spared from the torch. But Blackbeard did not burn Charleston. He could have, he had wanted to. But not for cruelty, it was theater. And theater had served him better than war. By nightfall, Valencia slept without fever for the first time in weeks. Elijah was no longer bound in rope, but words. Prophecy cradled him like wind does a feather. But above deck, as the city slipped behind them and the Queen Anne's Revenge turned toward the open Atlantic, another tale was taking shape. For somewhere along her hull, a cabin boy found a sealed letter tucked into a cannon's hollow. It smelled of tobacco, betrayal, and Virginia. Governor Spotswood had answered Charleston's cry. Lieutenant Robert Maynard was already setting sails, and Israel Hands, watching from the crow's nest, cracked his knuckles and whispered to himself the true currency of loyalty. It wasn't fear, it was timing. And blood. As the Evelyn did the wax, and her current in melting its line. Verkanning a bit both the max at the Yobo. Moonlight spilled upon the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, like spilled silver across old vellum, catching on ropes gone stiff with salt, and sails stained crimson from past conquests. The night was near silent, aside from the slosh of water, and an ever-deepening hum, the artifact again, pulsing faintly from beneath the captain's quarters. It hadn't stopped since the last tattoo had been revealed upon Elijah Crane's trembling arm. Now it called, not outward, but downward, its rhythm beating like a heart smothered in brass. Blackbeard stood alone at the prow, statuesque in the pale glow, hair braided with burning fuses that smoked faintly even in sleep. The wind curled around him like a serpent. In his hand, the second of the 3 tattoo fragments had begun to glow, if one could call that slight bruising hue light. Beside him stood Elijah, who, despite the hours of nausea and fear, bore that 3rd symbol carved unknowingly into him across generations. Behind them both, Anansi emerged from the dark like a shadow-given form, silent until he wasn't. Some veer straight to hell. Below decks, Calico Jack was already stowing his things, his mood sharpened by rumors and rattled bones. When confronted, he claimed the tides had turned too strange, too heavy with omen. Blackbeard made no effort to stop him. Some paths required cowardice to trim the weight. They began piecing together the blood compass by moonlight, with Elijah outlining what he'd interpreted from his father's journal. The tattoos, when laid end to end under the luna's gaze, didn't form a map, but a shape carved from constellations. "It's a mirror of the sky, as it was in 1491, Elijah whispered, fingers tracing lines that flickered with eerie phosphorescence. A sky no longer seen. It points to a celestial island, a hidden arc of emptiness in the West Indies, a rift between tides, near La Española, but not on any chart." Valencia, long silent, translated symbols newly awakened on the artifact, speechless again, yet her lips moved, forming cryptic symbols in the air. Now and again her eyes rolled back, and words older than any alphabet spilled in tones that made dogs howl on deck. That night Anansi began dreaming with his eyes open. He spoke in a tongue so ancient it made Israel Hands spit salt and blood trying to match it. Kogu Temo, da Anahid, Sacrifia, repeated over and over, blood, blood, old blood. What awaited them wasn't a place, it was a sacrifice. The stars demanded it. 3 nights passed in grim preparation. Storm after storm rolled behind them, feeding off something kindled by their course. Each sundown the artifact hummed louder, once small as a whisper, now a roar behind closed eyes. Rats leapt overboard, food spoiled mid-meal. Even the wood of the Queen Anne's Revenge, seaworthy as any ironclad, began to creak like it dreamed of drowning. Then, on the 6th night, after a day spent navigating waters that did not reflect their own sails, the blood compass led them to the edge of the known world. And there, rising like a wound in the ocean, was nothing. A jagged islet of obsidian protruded from the sea like a grave clawing its way out. There were no birds, The sky bent subtly around the isle, stars swerving and shifting, and atop that isle, like a crown laid upon stone, shimmered the moss-curtained ruins of some ancient watchtower, its angles all wrong to be mortal. They anchored just as the moon ripened full. Anansi wept openly. "The sea remembers," he muttered, "and the sea never forgives." The crew began murmuring of the Spanish occult armada, a myth dating back to conquistadors mad with power, crossing oceans not for gold, but for things older than gold. They had found something, the legends claimed, something buried deep beneath waves and memory, a secret that made emperors kneel and ships vanish without splinter. And this island was their tomb. As night fell, they made landfall. Valencia walked first, barefoot across the jagged black stone, unharmed, while my mind's like to leave pretty knack with things, and when I played old wax, and it would rush in a freak from the five as it, let me simplify this ballad. Put it stage, feminine Kevin schooled the clearance on the and how's that she arrayed have. That are contests, still you just each album of media to have the eats, and ticket contests, I stand and it is all started, and that lucky they would help the trances, and clumsily purchased, and it's more of the same things away. It's felt that I just go rule with because that yet what is there to what can go start after except get on or join you are kind of second that wherever you are champion. But BLACKBEARD'S, apple of dragons titular, yadblum, far below the sea floor. There's more still. Elijah whispered, horrified and hungry. This is not the end. Valencia, now walking as if dead and dreaming, led the way toward a hidden stairwell newly revealed, a spiral carved deep into the black rock. Torchlight failed upon its stones. Only the artifact's sick glow worked, guiding them downward, soundless but for the pulse of their own hearts. What lay beneath the island did not belong in the world of tides. They descended into a catacomb beneath even coral, walls etched in glyphs that moved freely, swimming across stone like minnows of ink. Images of men offering teeth to gods, bones braided into stars, ships carved not of wood, but of silence. Then the final chamber, a dome. Within, housed on pedestals, thrones. 3, each woven from coral and rib bones, topped with crowns of molten pearl. A voice slithered from nowhere, not heard, but felt. Choose. Blackbeard approached the middle throne. His hand gripped the back, and the glyphs upon the chamber began to mirror his tattoos. Shapes swirled upon the stone, forming cycles of death, rebirth, and conquest. The blood compass rose into the air, spinning, humming, then extinguishing its light as if in quiet reverence. He looked to Elijah, to hands, to the artifact, to the bleeding sea outside, and for a moment the king of pirates stood not as legend nor devil, but man. He said, "I choose," but none heard what came after. Above them, the sea began to swallow itself. The island screamed, far and wide. Sailors who slept that night awoke in cold sweat, clutching their chests, unaware why the moon wept tears of salt. When the Queen Anne's Revenge emerged from that isle hours later, she was changed. Her sails held no wind, her flag moved without breeze, and atop her deck Edward Thatch stood reborn, with no shadow, no warmth in his eyes, and a crown that wasn't there the day before. The Blood Compass, Chapter 7. The Temple at Dead Man's Sound. The sea had turned to ink as the Queen Anne's Revenge pierced the veil of dawn, creeping through the jagged maw of Dead Man's Sound. Not a soul aboard dared make a sound. The water rose in oily swells beneath a sky slashed purple with bruised light. Lightning coiled like serpents above, and the very air pulsed with a rhythm not unlike the thrum of a beating heart. The strait was narrow, bones of wrecked ships protruding from the shallows like the ribs of drowned leviathans. The coral here did not shimmer but hissed, releasing sulphurous breath as if protesting intrusion. From above, the isle took the shape of a broken skull, teeth of stone curling around the bay, cliffs rising like jagged jaws, no birds, no winds, only the steady grind of the ship's hull brushing against destiny. Below deck, the artifact pulsed continuously, blood-red and insistent. Locked in its brass cradle, it now trembled without touch. The markings, once dormant lines, had begun to bleed light, symbols animating and scrawling over themselves like a script continually rewriting its own flesh. Anansi had been the first to vanish. One moment he stood at the prow, eyes wide, wind pulling at the cords in his hair. The next, there was the echo of a laugh, oddly high-pitched and wrong, and nothing. Only a single black feather drifted down where he'd stood. Calico Jack had fled in Tortuga days before, claiming he dreamt of being trapped in mirrors, and Israel Hands had not spoken all night, sharpening his knife slowly without looking up. Only Valencia walked the deck now, her skin pearlescent, her eyes veiled in white. She whispered ceaselessly in a Proto-Taino language even Anansi had struggled to interpret. The moon had marked her. She bled moonlight, and around her the shadows bent, never quite touching, but always encircling. They anchored in the dead center of the bay, the ship sitting still as if nailed into place by unseen force. Before them, a great stair of barnacled stone led upward from the water into a cliffside temple mouth that screamed in silence, a dark hourglass-shaped opening carved too precisely for mortal hands. The crew hesitated, but Blackbeard did not. He stepped forward barefoot, beads of darkened fuse still braided into his beard, now frayed and extinguished from seawater and dreams. His coat billowed as though caught in winds that did not exist. On his belt hung twin flintlocks, pistols etched with alchemical scars, and at his back the sword he had taken from an English commodore who'd begged for mercy. Without a word he stepped onto the first stone. It lit with an eerie blue rune, glowed for a breath, and faded. He stepped again and again, each stone lighting and dimming as if matching his heartbeat. Behind him only Valencia followed immediately. Elijah Crane hesitated, clutching to his father's journal, eyes darting skyward as thunder argued with itself. Inside, the air was stale with centuries. The walls were ribbed in patterns foreign to any map. Hieroglyphs coiled like serpents chasing their tails. Carvings showed figures not quite human, elongated, half-aquatic things raising hands to skies that cracked open. Murals, flaked with salt, showed great ships riding not seas, but clouds of stars. Eyes, always eyes, stared back from every stone. They passed through a tunnel framed by pillars of crushed bone and basalt, only to emerge into a vast chamber neither above ground nor below. It simply was an impossible cathedral of stone illumined by an unseen source. There, at the heart of the structure, a dome rose with mechanisms embedded like veins. The floor was mirrored black crystal, and when they walked, they saw not reflections, but memories. Klung screamed as he saw his father's ship go up in flames. Valencia collapsed, chanting as if drowning. Blackbeard stood still. Before him, against the far wall, a stone throne rose from the center of a spiraled track in the floor. Etchings led from it outward in 3 serpentine trails to recessed altars, each containing a strange console formed like the mangled fusion of bone, metal, and coral. 3 glyphs pulsed on the nearest altar, the tattoos that had mapped their path glowing in harmony for the first time. Blackbeard approached, digging into the pouch at his side. He retrieved 3 pieces of preserved skin, circular slivers bearing the sigils. The first, taken from the madman Xavier, traded for promise. The second, sailor from Nassau who had not known the value, painted upon his back until it was too late. And the third, Elijah Crane, still alive, but marked forever. He placed each sigil into the corresponding socket. The chamber shivered. The spiral track in the floor hissed, lighting with a crimson line that slithered toward the throne. The air grew heavy, utterly, impossibly silent. Uenchi raised her head, eyes bleeding moonlight. "The choice is now," she whispered. "Life split from death, crowned or cursed." The tide hungers. From the ceiling above, a great oculus opened soundlessly, revealing stars swirling in an impossible formation. As light poured down, the artifact flew into the air on its own, hovering, spinning, then descending toward Blackbeard. It gently lowered itself into the throne's crest. He heard nothing, but everything. Voices of drowned men, winds from before time, the sound of fire and water, the creaking of the world's first mast. He saw visions, himself upon a throne, not of wood or gold, but of reef and shipwreck, coral encrusted into bone, barnacles scabbing his cheeks like regalia. He ruled not merely men, but time itself. Armies of the long dead marched beneath the sea at his command. Sailors whispered prayers to him in dark tides. The empires of Europe were insects compared to the dominion he held in that vision. But then he saw himself dissolve, skin like tar oozing from muscle, eyes gone hollow, memories fading into foam. The throne did not grant dominion, it consumed. The cost of rule was self. Behind him, Elijah pleaded, "Don't. That thing, it wants to be used." But Blackbeard was already leaning forward. The artifact split open, and something smiled inside it. The mechanism activated. A beam of light like blood forged into focus erupted upward through the oculus, up into the sky, through all storms. Somewhere across the world, lighthouses shattered and compasses spun madly. Whales screamed beneath the sea. The temple descended. Or perhaps the world rose. The chamber shook violently. From the mirrored floor emerged shapes, armored, aquiline, once men creatures, lost to time but bound to guard the secret of life and death. One lashed out at Valencia as she stood before them, mouth open in prayer. Her body collapsed like a shell, eyes still glowing as if her soul burned elsewhere. Another reached for Elijah, but it hesitated. It bent, touched his marked shoulder, and simply stared, then retreated. Blackbeard opened his eyes. He was upon the throne, but bound by unseen roots. The sigils were crawling up his arms, etching into his chest bleeding, glowing ink. And the throne asked, "Will you pay?" His voice was steady, unmoving. "I already have." The chamber answered with silence. And then everything screamed. The temple buckled, cracks spidered along the mirrored floor, releasing steam that carried voices, wails of sailors from ages lost. One of the guardians disintegrated into salt. The throne pulsed hotter. Elijah began to chant words not his own, staring into nothing. And Edward Thatch, Blackbeard, understood. He stood, not man, not God, but something in between. The chamber had not preserved him. It had judged him worthy of bearing memory. Not immortality, but remembrance. He reached behind his neck, tore free the final sigil burned into his flesh, and cast it into the oculus. The light died. Instantly, the temple fell still. The guardians crumbled into silt. The stone uncoiled. The mechanism stopped. Only the sound of dripping water remained, and the throne was empty. At the temple's mouth, Elijah sat in the ashlight, alone. Beside him, Valencia's body was gone. The artifact lay cracked. Inert, the sea waited. Moments passed, years, or none at all. A wave crashed in the distance, and the sound echoed, carrying laughter on its edge. Not mockery, not madness, but freedom. The Queen Anne's Revenge sat idle in the bay, her sails torn, her crew gone. Yet from beneath the hull something stirred. A pulse, faint. The compass, once broken, spun now in time with the tide. And far above, on the highest cliff of Dead Man's Sound, a figure appeared, silhouetted by moonlight, hat wide-brimmed, coat aflame at the edges, watching, waiting, listening. As the wind returned heavy that day, thick with salt and secrets, whispering through the rigging of Queen Anne's Revenge like the breath of something old, older than empires, older than the sea's own memory, she lurched through the waves as though wounded, her once gilded frame dulled by twisted barnacles and smoke-slick scars. Her sails, once black emblems of dread, now hung torn like the standards of fallen kingdoms. The storm that gathered overhead was not merely a force of nature, but a reckoning. Blackbeard stood at the helm, not moving, not blinking, a statue carved from obsidian and myth. His beard, still braided with ember fuses that had long since ceased to burn, clung to his jaw with the weight of a burial shroud. His eyes were distant, less in thought, more in eternity, gazing not at the sea or sky, but a place beyond both. Since leaving Dead Man's Sound, he had spoken only in murmurs and riddles, when he spoke at all, and still the crew did not question him, not aloud. For all their mutterings and widening eyes, for all the omens and losses, they followed, because fear in the end inspires not only obedience, but faith. Below deck, Elijah Crane kept to dim corners, hunched over a tattered journal that had belonged to his father, translating feverishly by lantern light. Sketched in the margins were diagrams of the temple's inner sanctum, symbols that aligned not only with the tattoos but with the shifting positions of stars. The legacy had not been gold, nor power as men understood power. It was a conduit, a door. But to what? He had lined the pages with warnings in ink and blood. It awakens, it hungers. Do not bring it back. Too late. Though the artifact now lay sealed in a heavy oak box, hidden behind bolts and layered cloth in the rear hold, its pulse could still be felt through the planks, steady, like the heartbeat of a sleeping leviathan. And it was louder now. Crane had pleaded with Blackbeard again and again in vain. "You must throw it back to the depths. Whatever you saw in that temple, it should never see the light again." But Blackbeard had only looked at him with something that might have been pity or prophecy. On deck, the crew whispered of curses, of ghostly shadows seen flitting across the sails at night, of sleepwalkers repeating prayers in dead languages. A gunner had slit his own throat mid-prayer. Cabin boy Thomas claimed to hear music from beneath the water. Another swore he'd seen Anansi walking along the boom, upside down, skittering like a spider. But these were not what broke them. It was Israel Hands. Quartermaster, confidant, killer, friend. Hands had been at Blackbeard's side since the taking of Concord, but now something in him curdled. His eyes never met his captain's. He took to whispering near the powder kegs, drinking more heavily than usual, questioning commands under breath. He met with the British envoy off San Miguel under cover of darkness, delivering a map inked with desperation, the precise cove where Queen Anne's revenge was headed. Ocracoke. The British fleet was to wait there in silence, their powder dry, their swords sharp. In return, Hans would walk free, a pardon in his pocket, and gold enough to start anew in the colonies. And yet, treason gnaws sharpest at the soul when dressed as duty. Even as he gave up the coordinates, his voice trembled. "He's not the man he was," he said. "He brought something back, something wrong. He ain't him anymore." The night before they reached the cove, Crane found the betrayal in Hans's journal, hidden beneath a false stone in his bunk. The entry was sparse, almost reluctant. Ocracoke, 3 days, rendezvous with Maynard. It ends there. Crane showed the note to Blackbeard. The captain read it in silence, the shadows playing tricks on his worn face. And then, after a long silence, he laughed. Not the hearty laugh of a man drunk on rum and loot, but the dry laugh of a man who has read his own funeral rites and finds irony in their poetry. "I always knew he would," Edward said. "Can't blame him. End was always going to come from within. He didn't punish Hans, he didn't alert the crew. Instead, he invited his quartermaster to share a drink that night. Just 2 men beneath the stars. No words between them. Dozen bottle passed back and forth. The same bottle they'd toasted with after taking Queen Anne's revenge all those long years ago. The next morning, Israel Hans was gone. No one saw him leave. A single black feather floated in his hammock. When they dropped anchor off the coast of Ocracoke, sea-birds circled strangely low. The surrounding waters were unnaturally still, mirrored, as though waiting for the sky to fall in. Blackbeard walked the deck barefoot, marking symbols into the wood with chalk and iron nails, speaking in a voice not entirely his own. Only Crane remained close by, now utterly convinced that whatever god the artifact served had not followed them. It had become them. Inland, British ships sat in wait. Governor Spotswood had pulled every string, bribed every officer, and burned every favor to see this day arrive. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the HMS Pearl waited on deck beneath a white flag updated not with truce, but judgment. He was said to wear iron under his uniform and sleep amidst oaths. The night before, he had whispered a prayer to his blade, not to God, but to his father, slain by pirates off Jamaica. This wasn't law to him. It was vendetta. When Maynard glimpsed Queen Anne's revenge on the horizon, his eyes didn't narrow. They widened. It wasn't the ship. It was the shadow it cast upon the sea. Wrong. Bent. Like something not entirely real. Blackbeard knew it was a trap. The sails said so. The stars said so. Crane begged once more. "We can go north. Disappear. Let the world forget." But the captain only smiled, and his teeth, now blackened not only by powder but time itself, showed in full as he said, "No, lad, you don't cheat the end. You bargain with it." His men gathered, those few still left, gaunt and pale. A third had jumped ship in the last port, a few more had vanished outright, and yet they stood ready, blades sharpened, muskets dry, powder fresh, perhaps not for plunder, but for closure. Blackbeard lifted a blade that wasn't his own, stolen from the temple, and pointed it toward shore. "They want a devil. Let's give 'em one." Then the artifact, deep below, pulsed once more. And overhead, clouds that had drifted apart cracked open like a berth, revealing not moonlight nor sun, but something in between. The sea began to boil. The crew readied themselves for battle. But Blackbeard walked to the prow and cast the sealed oak box into the churned waters. It did not sink. It floated, then cracked open, lightning rippling in every direction like veins born from the ocean itself. And the tide turned. In the distance British horns cried. Sails shifted, birds screamed backwards, and the Queen Anne's Revenge, aglow with unholy fire behind hull and mast, turned her wrath to shore. Maynard smiled, sword drawn, his own death already accepted. Blackbeard, watching from afar, whispered to the wind, "This was never about the crown. This was never about coin." His crew shouted behind him, calloused voices uniting for one final cry, "For dread, for madness, for the sea!" The last thing Crane saw before the ships collided was the captain raising both arms to the storm, not in surrender, but in welcome. Then came Chapter 9. The Devil's Tide. Ocracoke. The sun had not risen, and yet the world was already ablaze with the thunderous overture of war. The sea foamed black beneath a bruised sky, and lightning stitched jagged scars into the horizon. The air was thick with brine and blood, and above all else an unnatural silence lingered just before the first cannon erupted. Queen Anne's Revenge stood proud, dark against the gathering dawn, her timbers groaning like an old god waking from slumber. Smoke curled softly from slits in her deck, and her sails, once bright as thunderclouds, hung tattered but defiant. The ship looked wounded, yet wore her scars like medals of defiance. At her helm stood Edward Thatch, Blackbeard, silent as iron, his face streaked with soot and salt, and his cold dark beard threaded with smoldering fuses that hissed and sparked each time he breathed. Across the water the ships of the Royal Navy approached like solemn executioners. Lieutenant Robert Maynard stood tall aboard the HMS Ranger, eyes narrowed, a white scarf tied across his face like a shroud. He wore no color save the red of vengeance in his gaze and the steel of duty at his hip. Blackbeard knew the end had come, perhaps not his death, but an ending all the same. He felt it in the wood underfoot, in the whispers of the wind, in how the artifact, hidden in the captain's quarters, no longer pulsed, but hummed, like a locked door waiting for a final key. Beside Blackbeard, Elijah Crane shivered. His bones ached with prophetic dread, and the tattoo upon his shoulder, once dormant, now itched like living fire. He turned to the pirate captain, eyes desperate, mouth trembling. "Run, Edward! You can still cross the shoals. Tiburon, the isles to the south. Hide! They won't catch you through the reefs." But Edward only smiled, not cruelly, not even proudly. He smiled like a man who had heard the sea say his name for the final time. "I ran once, became a myth. Now let the myth bleed." With a cry that awakened echoes in men's souls, Blackbeard shouted down to the gunners, "Let the devil know we're home!" The first broadside shook the world. Boarding planks slammed against hulls, pistols flared like fireflies, and timbers splintered beneath boots and blood. Pirate and sailor collided like two crashing tempests, neither willing to yield. The air sang with screams and steel, and every second stretched like the drumbeat of fate. Blackbeard surged forward like a fury unbound. His cutlass danced in one hand, a sawed-off flintlock in the other. He fought like the sea he ruled, unyielding, merciless, elemental. Each man who stood before him fell without even the grace of a scream. His fuse-lit beard flared blindingly when blood struck it, an unnatural blaze that made the bravest tremble. They said he had survived bullets, blades, boiling tar. They said he was already dead. Maynard aboard the Ranger shouted for a trap. He had hidden his strongest men below deck, waiting. Blackbeard, boarded and seemingly victorious, was outnumbered in an instant. And still he laughed. Oh, the sound of that laughter, cracking through the chaos, was unlike anything the sea had ever heard. It was not mirth, not madness. It was defiance so old it echoed from the bones of drowned ships. His boot struck the Ranger's deck. Blood soaked the boards. Crane stumbled behind, dragging a scorched journal, the artifact tucked tightly in a cloth pouch on his chest. It vibrated against his heart like a second soul. Then the duel began. Blackbeard against Maynard. Not men now, but avatars. Archetypes of rebellion and order. Fire against blade. Chaos against law. Maynard lunged low, swept up his saber, slicing through air. Blackbeard countered with such violence the shock wave knocked both men from their feet. They rose, panting, faces inches apart. "I heard," hissed Maynard, "that you dine with ghosts." "I am the ghost," Blackbeard replied, and met him again in battle. The fight was brutal, short, beautiful, horrifying. Maynard was fast, skilled, relentless. But Blackbeard, he was inevitable. Cut, stabbed, shot, not once, not twice, 5 times. 6 still, he fought on. One sailor watched in awe as Blackbeard, spitting froth and iron, fought with half his beard aflame and a sword embedded in his shoulder. "By God," the man whispered, "he ain't man. He's tide-turned flesh, but even tides turn, and bones, unlike myths, break." Maynard drove his dagger, a hidden, short, dirty blade beneath Blackbeard's rib. The pirate's body convulsed. The fire in his beard flared one final time, casting light across the whole deck before extinguishing. His hand spasmed. His eyes, wild and bright till then, softened. He looked at Crane not with fear, only with a burning, silent warning. "Don't forget," he mouthed. "Remember me as storm, not as stillness." Then Maynard pressed him to the deck, and as the sun broke the horizon, it cast its first light upon Edward Thatch's decapitated form, a silhouette of carnage haloed by gold. His head was lifted like a trophy, his body left to the sea. And yet, beneath the waves, in the shattered remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge, something shifted. The artifact, nestled in its box of brass and bone, began to glow anew. red, then green, then a soft shade of blue like the light of moonless tides. It rose slightly, as if breathed upon, and released a pulse, a single, quiet note, resonant as the heartbeat of the deep itself. Elijah Crane alone felt it. He had escaped the melee, dragged unconscious into the hold by a dying crewman. Blood had soaked the Latin words of his father's journal. When he awoke, the words glimmered with new meaning. Not all legacies speak through blood. Some lingers in the breath of stories, some in surf, others beneath bone. Out at sea a storm began to gather once again, not of clouds, but of whispers. Sailors in Tortuga told tales of a dark ship seen in moonlight without sails. Children in Havana dreamed of a man with eyes like obsidian and fire swinging from his beard, who asked them riddles in their sleep. Fishers dragged up ancient coins where charts showed no wreck, and in Virginia, Maynard slept not a single night without tasting salt on his tongue and waking to the phantom scent of sulphur. They buried Blackbeard's head on a pike, but the sea took the rest, and the sea does not give back in silence. Legends spoke of a promise that when empire grows too thirsty, when coin outweighs conscience, and when ships of war once again drown the reefs of the New World, the tide will rise unnaturally high. One man's name will be its storm cry, and Queen Anne's revenge, rebuilt from shattered myth and bone-black timber, shall glide across the tides once more, bearing the soul of rebellion. For what dies in the Golden Age of Piracy